Come for the bread, stay for the politics. I'm Ben Walsh, and this is Let Them Eat Bread. Today on Let Them Eat Bread, we are going to try making a loaf pan white loaf again. This is essentially a replay episode of episode 5, given that episode 5 had some technical issues and we weren't able to debut that episode or this recipe. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this recipe, but first, let's get our yeast mixture started. Here I have half a cup of drinking water warmed to 100 degrees. And in this bowl, I have, on the one side, I have 2 teaspoons of white superfine sugar. And over here, I have 1 packet or 2 1/4 teaspoons of active dry yeast. So as usual, we're going to pour these into our bowl here, and we're going to lightly fluff with our fork. Remember that fluffing motion is essentially you're just taking your fork and making this motion, a round motion here. If you can't get your water to about 100 degrees, which is whereabouts this water is, you want to use what I call the pinky test. And the pinky test is just where you warm the water up until you feel like you would be ready to bathe in it. So you use your pinky finger. If it feels warm enough to bathe in, it's good enough for your yeast. Just setting a timer for 10 minutes here. This will help us. This is going to give us all the time we need for our yeast to bloom. You'll start to see a little bit of foam coming up on the top here. That means your yeast is alive and active and ready to get rising some bread. So this is actually one of the easiest bread recipes out there. I love this recipe. It makes a lovely white bread with a gorgeous crunchy crust. And it's great for sandwiches. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's wonderful for sandwiches. And actually, it's really just kind of nice to just eat whenever. It's great, makes great toast as well. One thing I will say about this bread recipe is because it's not an enriched dough like we normally do with our challah, we are going to have to make this at a very high temperature. So don't do it now, obviously, but we're going to set our ovens to about 400 degrees a little later when we are ready to bake this. All right, so here I have between 3 3/4 and 4 cups of flour. I typically stick with the lower number of 3 3/4 cups of flour. This is so that I can make sure that if there is going to be some extra of an ingredient, it's extra liquid, because I can always add flour to it during the kneading process, which will make up for the fact that I didn't add all my flour in the beginning. It's a little harder to add liquid afterwards, so I like to always have a little bit more liquid as opposed to a little bit more flour. So this is actually a good hint anytime you're making bread. If a bread recipe gives you a range of flour amounts you can use, typically like 1/4 or 1/2 cup between the 2 values, always take the lower value. Worst case scenario, you have a little bit of a wetter dough as you need it, and you can always add more flour to it to dry it out. So anyway, that said, I have about 3 3/4 cups of all-purpose flour here. We're not using bread flour for this. You can if you want to. It makes for a chewier bread, but I find this bread is already very chewy as is. So we are just going to use regular all-purpose flour. Oh, and one more thing I forgot to mention. This recipe comes to us from James Beard's on Bread. So yeah, if you need the recipe or want the book, you can see it here, the book anyway. And the recipe, of course, as always, will be posted underneath. Credit to James Beard. All right, so to our flour, we are going to add simply 1 tablespoon of kosher salt. You can use table salt. There's nothing wrong with it. I prefer to use kosher salt. And I find that a tablespoon is generally a good amount. For a bread like this that doesn't get a ton of sweetener in it, you want to be careful with adding extra salt because it will start to taste salty, which you definitely don't want as part of your bread. And I'm just using a regular wooden spoon to mix this all together here. And as I said, this is an incredibly easy recipe. Not only are the only ingredients flour, water, sugar, and salt, it's very easy to put together. So as soon as our yeast is done blooming, and we have 7 minutes on our timer, but you can actually see that the yeast is starting to bloom already. So the reason I set a timer for 10 minutes, oftentimes there's other things I need to do in preparing for the bread, in preparing the dough. But the truth is, as soon as you see this little bloom here, this little bit of foam on top, I don't know if you can see from the camera. Let me see if I can bring it a little closer. So hopefully you can see there's 2 layers here. There's a yeast layer and there's a bubble layer and a liquid layer. But anyway, as soon as that foam layer starts to form on top, your yeast is ready. You don't have to wait the full 10 minutes if you don't want to. It will just cause for more of that yeast layer to form. And it can potentially alter your rise time. Although with a bread like this, it shouldn't matter too much, but it's up to you. At this point, we've been making bread together for long enough that you should start to have a sense of what bread feels like, what things you need to be looking out for when you're starting to make your bread loaves. Especially we've used active yeast for all of this. We are going to start using instant yeast soon, but for now we're going to use active dry. It's kind of the base yeast for a lot of different bread recipes, so it's good to get familiar with how to use it. Instant yeast is a little bit easier to use because you don't bloom it, you just put it in and let it do its thing. However, breads that are done with instant yeast tend to rise a little longer, sometimes twice as long. It really depends on a lot of factors. But the truth is, if you want a bread that's going to rise in about an hour, active dry yeast is usually the way you want to go. So we will definitely get to making bread with instant yeast. I have lots of instant yeast that I need to use. And it's also, it's not difference in price. So you just walk down your bakery aisle and there should be little packets of it there. One more little thing before we check our yeast, a little bit of housekeeping. We are off next week for Memorial Day weekend and the weekend after that. So we will pick up the show, as it were, on June 12th instead of June 5th. So we're going to be off for the next 2 weeks. I will still be making bread, and I'll probably post some announcements on our Facebook page. If there is a bread that you are making, obviously, please feel free to share it with us. Either post it on our Facebook page or send it to us in Messenger. If you have a recipe that you would like me to make when we come back from break, definitely do that. I'm really looking forward to continue to bake with you guys. But just so you know, episode 12 of Let the Meat Bread won't be until June 12th. So hopefully it's easy to remember. Episode 12 on 6/12. I just made that mnemonic up right now, so maybe it won't help. But if it does, great. Either way, June 12th at noon, 12th episode. All right, so we have about 4 minutes left on our timer, and it is very clear now that our yeast is alive and well and ready to go. So I'm going to turn off our timer. And so what I'm going to do here with my flour salt mixture is I'm going to create a well. Remember, the purpose of creating this well is to allow the passive mixing as much as possible. So you want those walls to be really high up in that bowl. If you're using a standing mixer for this, you're just going to make sure that you've got your dough hook running on the salt and flour mixture for about 30 seconds. That'll get your well for you. If you want your well to be more defined, you can have it mix the ingredients for a minute or longer. It doesn't matter. You're not developing gluten by doing it this way because there's no liquid to pull the strands apart. So, all right, we're going to pour our yeast mixture in first. All right, and then next, we are going to pour in our water mixture. Well, not mixture, our water. This is a cup and a half of water. It's warmed to about the same amount. So we're just going to pour this in here. All right, so now you've got a ratio of about 2 cups of water to about 4 cups of flour. So just keep that in mind as we go forward for when you're adding things to it. This is about a 2-to-1 ratio, wet to dry. Sorry, dry to wet. So we're just using a wooden spoon here. You can see I'm just doing a light, slow mixing here. And we're just doing this until a shaggy dough forms. Nothing special here. Again, this is meant to be an incredibly easy bread recipe that you can make, in a pinch. You don't need any special ingredients. As long as you have some water, some salt, and honestly, you don't need that much salt. A few shakes of your table shaker should be plenty. the ability to heat some water and some yeast, you can make this bread. Very, very simple. And it really does, it really does make a nice loaf. If you're not a huge fan of white breads, you can experiment with other types of flours for this recipe. Or you can experiment with this base recipe, right? You can add things, subtract things to it based on what your preferences are. But this is a really good kind of base recipe. And really, I should have done episode 1. This really should have been the first episode of Let Them Eat Bread. But I really love my challah recipe, and it's a big favorite in my house. So it's always kind of the default recipe for me to make. All right, so you can see now that I have a very rough dough that's formed. It's almost entirely into a ball, but you can see it's a little wet. You can see it's very sticky, right? It's hanging off my spoon here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put this aside for a moment. We are going to use a very, very light dusting of flour here. Remember, you can always add more, but only start with a little. And we are going to spoon out our dough to the best of our ability onto here. Now, if it sticks inside the bowl, that is just going to be a-okay. That's not a problem. Just come back in there with your spoon and just scrape that out. And if it's sticking to your spoon, dip your fingers in some flour, or flour your hands and just use them to remove the excess dough from your spoon. All right, this is pretty much done. You can see I pretty much got all the dough out of here. All right, so you can see I have a little bit more on my spoon, so I'm just gonna put a little bit of flour on it to help my hands. Oops, a little bit too much flour. That's right. So I'm gonna use my hands here and just, get rid of that extra. You are not gonna need your spoon again, so if you want, throw it in the sink or place it gently in the sink, whatever you prefer. Okay. All right, so just get off as much as you can. Some of this dough is going to stick. That's all right. It'll stick to your hands. It'll stick to the spoon. That's what kneading's for. And then adding flour. So we're in the process of making it less sticky, but for now, don't worry too much about it. Okay. You'll start to notice that the dough feels both very warm and very soft. This is because there's nothing really complex about it. And you pretty much want all of your dough to feel about this soft. So if you're finding that you're making recipes and the dough doesn't feel very soft or very pliable, look at your ratios of dry to wet ingredients. You might need more wet ingredients because your dough will firm up a little bit as you add dry ingredients to it. When it's nice and sticky like this, it's going to be nice and soft. So I'm doing a one-handed knead here so that I can add flour later. You can see that I'm just kind of moving the dough around to pick up some of that excess flour on the board. If you have a, what's this called? Goodness gracious, I'm drawing a blank, guys. I'm sorry. Bench scraper. If you have a bench scraper, to help you move your bread around, that's fine too. All right, so this bread clearly needs some more flour. So we're going to just, again, lightly sprinkle it and the board with some more flour. Remember, there was a dearth of about a 1/4 cup of flour for what the recommended amount is. You may end up using more, but all right, so this is sticking a little bit. Let's move this over here. This is our oil for later, by the way. I didn't forget an ingredient. That's our oiling the bowl oil. All right, so you can see now it's absorbing the flour very well. So just keep using one hand, move the dough around, make sure that it keeps moving around. Remember, the goal is tacky but not sticky. And if it's doing this, it's not done yet. So if you need to, you can use your bench scraper as well just to get the excess dough off your hands. Remember, when you're kneading, you want to turn your dough each time you knead. The reason that this is important is it allows the entirety of your dough to get kneaded as opposed to one part, which gets getting pulled and pushed the whole time. So just make sure you're doing that. And if you don't really like the dough sticking to your hands and it really bothers you, next time you take some flour out, also sprinkle some on your hands. It will help the dough to not stick to your hands as much. But also, as you can see, the dough comes off fairly easily with a bench scraper. Oh, one last thing that I typically say, but I haven't said so far this episode, which is don't worry about your hands being on the dough. This dough bakes. You don't really need to worry about anything that's on your hands. Your hands should be clean, of course. You should be washing your hands before you start to bake bread, before you start to make dough. But if for whatever reason you're worried about, dead skin or whatever on your hands, don't be. Bakes off. Anything that could be harmful to you pretty much bakes off. So important to remember that as well. Okay, so you can see that I'm adding more flour to it. It clearly needs more flour, right? It's still sticky. All right, so it's starting to come together now. And this should actually, this is an easy one to knead one-handed. It's a pretty small loaf. If you want to do you can make this into a bulk recipe if you want, depending if you have a lot of loaf tins, or if you want to make free-form loaves. I'm going to show you how to make a free-form loaf today as well with this bread. We're gonna do that as well. So don't worry. I'm going to show you how to do this both with and without tools as usual. The name of the game on this show is accessibility. So we want to make sure that everyone can access how to make bread, because bread is one of those staples that you can't go without. People start revolutions over. Oh, speaking of accessibility, I recently learned from a friend of mine who is also a YouTuber that in order for this to be captioned live as I'm speaking, we need 1,000 subscribers, which is a lot. So if you would be so kind as to let your friends know that Let Them Eat Bread is out there, whether they watch or not. Obviously, we'd like them to watch. We want our videos getting out there. I think the politics, the worker-centered politics I talk about are typically important. But also, more importantly, bread is so important. It'd be nice if more people knew how to make it. So get your friends, your family to subscribe. I don't ask you guys to share individual videos. I don't ask for likes or comments or anything. But it would help to be more accessible to a larger audience if we could have 1,000 subscribers. So greatly appreciate any evangelizing on that front that you can possibly do to get us more subscribers so that we can have closed captioning while the stream is actually live instead of just waiting for when the video is over. Just for the accessibility portion of the show. All right, so you can see at this point, the dough is no longer sticky. It's still a bit tacky, which is great. Some dough is sticking to my hands, but not really that much. I can kind of get it off pretty easily without having to involve the bench scraper. So you're just going to keep kneading it until you think it's ready. Remember, as you knead it, as you pull those strands, it may require more flour, so just be mindful of that. If it starts to get sticky and less tacky, add more flour. And of course, keep kneading it. And with each knead, rotate. Super important to make sure that all of the bread is getting kneaded. You want your bread to rise nice and evenly, and the best way to make sure that happens is by making sure that it is kneaded appropriately. So as you can see, I really haven't switched much from the one-handed. I haven't needed to use kind of a two-handed knead for this. This dough is very, very forgiving and very light and soft. So if you're needing to use two hands to knead this, one, you should probably subject your bread to the window pane test because it's probably done and it's probably a little tough as well. Or you may have a bread that's too dry, which you can fix. It's possible to fix it even at this late stage of the process if you add a little bit of moisture to it and knead that moisture in really well. You can save a bit of bread that is not cooperating. But for the most part, you really don't want to be messing with it too much at this stage as far as liquid goes. And by the way, that's one of the reasons I say, when in doubt, add less flour. So you can always add more in the kneading process. See, I just put a lot of flour on my board here. And that's because the dough got very sticky very quickly. So again, it's about feel. Be mindful. And if you've been kneading it for a while and you're like, you know what, it's tacky. I'm not sure I could knead it anymore. I'm not sure if I'm over kneading it. One of the things that you should know is that if you're kneading by hand, it's almost impossible to over knead your dough. You need to be kneading for like an hour to over knead your dough. It's very difficult to do if you're doing it by hand. Now, if you're doing it with a machine, like a standing mixer, because it does the kneading for you and it moves it very quickly and creates those gluten strands in a different way, you can over knead it with that. So if you're using a machine, just be careful. Check your dough regularly. Just make sure that you've got the right, that you don't over knead it, because you can in a machine. All right, this is still kneading. No pun intended. This still requires some more flour. So just keep going with it. Remember, you're trying to stretch that dough every time. Make sure that you're actually developing some gluten on our board here. All right. Let's take a little bit of our dough here. Oh, it's still sticky, so this is going to need more flour no matter what, but let's just see how good of a job we've done with kneading it so far. Oh no, it broke. See, it broke right through. Actually, it was better so you can see. Well, can you see now? No. Okay, that's not done. Not even close. And it looks like this is going to need a lot more flour, which is great. No problem there at all. So now I'm going to add a little bit more flour to it. Let's start with like 1/8 of a cup of flour, and we'll go from there. Remember, if your bread is sticking to your board, always use a bench. You can always use a bench scraper or a knife to just get it off of there. If you have little parts of your bread that's sticking to the board, or for some reason the dough is leaving little tracks, or it's bleaching the board, again, just use a bench scraper to get some of that stuff up, and you can mix it into the bread, and it will not harm the bread. So don't worry about that. And oftentimes, those little bits that are stuck on the board, are good for the bread too. So just, if you need to in the middle, just kind of like get a hard scrape in there. Get some of that flour and water mix off your board. No worries. It will act as more dry ingredient. You can just mix it right in. Again, just keep kneading until your dough is ready to go. And you will know that once it remains tacky, it doesn't get stickier again. But also pass the window pane test, which ours got close, but it didn't actually pass it. So we're going to keep working here. I'm going to keep working on this, and when it comes back to being sticky again, which it's kind of getting to, you can kind of see now that it's sticking more to my hands. Just keep working with it. And again, one of the nice things about this recipe is that it's very forgiving. So you need to add more flour to it. It's not going to stop you. And adding more flour to it is not going to damage your bread. All right, I'm going to add a little bit more flour to this, and then I think we are close to done. I can feel that it's getting nice and stretchy. So if it's really sticking and you need to make it easier, see what I'm doing here? I'm taking the bread dough and I'm coating it in the flour on all sides before I start kneading it again. This is just so it doesn't stick to my hands. You do not have to use this method. I like to. I find it's easier to manipulate the bread once I've started doing that. See if there's anything in the chat for me to address while I'm kneading here. No, there is not. If you have questions about bread or about any of the topics that we talk about as we're talking about them, I keep the chat up the entire time. So if for some reason I say something that doesn't make sense, that you don't understand, you disagree with, chat. Throw it in the chat. Or if you see it after we're live, throw a comment. I will respond. I read all comments. I actually got a great comment recently from someone, I forget their YouTube handle, so apologies to them, outlining a different type of UBI. And essentially giving me a separate set of numbers to work with than the ones that I proposed in my UBI segment, which was great. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness of that. So I read all the comments. If you want to leave a comment, I read all the chats. If you want to leave a chat, no pressure. But that way we can do the show together, and we can make both bread and politics more accessible to regular people. And besides, what else you got going on this Saturday, right? You only have to make bread. Take it outside, do your weeding, whatever it's going to be. Throw on a headset. Just listen. All right, so I think this is pretty much ready to go. All right, so I'm going to just put this into a ball here. As usual, we're going to take our little bead. Let's see, this may actually need some more flour, but I think it's probably done the kneading process. So let's see. Yeah, I can see some light coming through there right now. Yeah, this is done. So if you can see, yeah, you can see the light coming through there. Okay, so we're gonna give these a couple more kneads just to get it a little less tacky. Throw a little bit more flour on it. And we are ready to rise. Well, our bread is. I mean, you can be ready to rise too. Rise up, you know. Rise like bread. Oops. Right. A few more kneads to get this together. And get the remainder of the flour off of our board here. Right, and you should actually feel the bread firm up just a little bit as you knead it. So if it is firming up just a touch, that is A-okay. It also means the bread's probably close to the maximum capacity it has for flour, which is great because we really want to make sure that we have put enough flour in here so it gets nice and big and we can make nice, luscious loaves for our week of bread eating. Bread is a staple in my house. It's probably a staple in most houses, but we use it for sandwiches, toast, French toast, all sorts of fun stuff. And actually, we have a little bit for our last week's loaf available, so that's probably going to be French toast at some point. The challah recipe that we do on the show actually makes for a really, really great French toast. This one, not so much. This one you want to use as sandwiches and toast. And if you are toasting it, by the way, you want to make sure that the toast that when you're putting it in the toaster, you want a higher temperature toast. Okay, let me rinse my hands so they're covered in flour, and then we'll get ready to rise our bread. All right. So now we do what we do every week. I have a glass bowl I'm going to use for the rising of my bread, which means I need to warm it. So I'm going to do that real quick. Well, actually, it doesn't feel cold at all. Actually, it feels pretty room temperature. So actually, I'm not going to warm it this week. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take about 1 to 2 tablespoons of oil. Just pour that in our bowl here. That may have been a little too much. Just gauge it. There's no real harm in putting oil in this, by the way. All right. And as usual, we are going to allow our oil to coat our bowl. And then when it is finished doing that, we're just going to go to our hands and move it in around the bowl. You want a light layer of oil around the entirety of the bowl. If there's extra oil and you don't want it there, just take a paper towel and get rid of it. Yeah, we're going to have a little bit extra oil here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a paper towel and I'm just going to get rid of some of this oil because I put too much in. Just fine. No worries. You do want to leave just enough oil in the bottom of your bowl, though, that you can roll your ball of dough in it. This is, again, to make sure that nothing sticks. So we're just going to absorb some of that extra oil at the bottom here. And we've got a nice little chunk of oil at the bottom. Make sure everything is nice and lubricated, of course, but anything extra can go in the bin. Alrighty, so time to take our dough, which is still nice and lovely. Roll it around in the oil for a little bit. Make sure that it's covered in oil. The sole purpose of doing this, guys, is to make sure it doesn't stick. So you want there to be enough oil covering your loaf that it doesn't stick. All right. Then we are going to cover this in plastic wrap and then put a towel on top of that, set a timer for an hour, and then we will be ready to talk some politics this week. All right. Let's try not to break our island here. So I use plastic wrap because it's easiest. If you have a reusable wrap or something like that, or you just want to use a towel, that's fine. The only thing I'll say about just using a towel is that you'll need to wash that towel every week because it will have had raw dough on it. And there is salmonella in raw flour. I also partake in cookie dough, so I'm definitely a hypocrite here, but you should not be eating raw flour if you can avoid it. All right, our tea towel. Oops. Looks like I spilled my water a little bit. Luckily not on my laptop. Okay. It's fine. All right. So we're going to just leave this on here. We're going to put this in the back. Set a timer. All right, so there's our hour timer. I'm gonna put this to the side. Let's see what's on the whiteboard this week. All right, so now we are going to see our bread that has risen. Let's bring this guy over here. Big reveal. Holy moly, look at that. That bread has more than doubled in size. Okay, great. So we're gonna put our towel over here for now. It's good, it's nice and warm in here. Okay. So we are going to be making 2 loaves today, a freeform and a loaf pan loaf. As promised, let's take our plastic, put it over here on our scale. Let's just pour this out. Come on. There you go. Oh, that was more difficult than it had to be. All right. So we're just going to knead this together real quick to get the air out of it, but also to get it nice and tacky again, to get it as one whole thing. We are then going to divide it in 2 and shape it. And I'll tell you what to do with it as we move forward. All right, so this did not need a ton of kneading. Ooh, it smells so good. It smells so nice. Okay. So you're gonna see it's pretty similar size to what it was before. Don't worry about that. All right, so let's weigh it first, see how much it weighs, and then we can divide that in 2. Oh, we're in pounds, okay. Boop. All right, so this weighs about 40 ounces. Oops. So we want 2 20-ounce loaves. As a reminder, 16 ounces in a pound, so it's about 1.5 pounds loaves-ish. Pound and a quarter loaves. All right, so let's just get this into a nice little ball. Hopefully this is right in half. If not, well, I'll figure it out. Oh, 20 exactly, look at that. Look at that. Are we good today or what? All right, so we're gonna take this and we're gonna make it into a ball. I'm gonna set this on the side over here. Now, good time, by the way, if you are, now's a good time to butter and line your loaf tin and your tray. So you can see what I'm doing here is I'm just trying to get this to be rounder and flatter. And the reason we're doing this is because we're going to roll this up. So one of the ways that you can do this, so use gravity. Gravity is your friend to kind of make this as round as possible. Stretch those edges out. Just use your fingers to make this as round as possible. It may be difficult to do. Don't worry about that. If it gets too thin in one place or too thick in another, just use your fingers, press it back into the middle. The dough is very forgiving at this stage as well, so don't worry about it. Just keep moving it around until it's more or less an oval. Or a circle. Circle's fine. This is probably as round as it's going to get. It's weird pentagram type thing, but it's all right. All right. So this is going to be our free form. So what we're going to do is we're going to take one side here, take and fold. Take the other side here, take and fold, and then we are going to roll like a burrito our bread. So this shape, this round shape here that I just created is called a batard, B-A-T-A-R-D. And this is going to rise into our ovular loaf. So if you want, now you can see that my ends are sticking out a little bit here. Just tuck them in and on both sides and you're doing this because you want it to be ovular, not less tube-like than mine is. But it's all right, it'll do. So this one is going to be different than this one that we were just doing. We're just going to take and form into a tube. All right? And so the reason we're doing that is because we're going to rise it in this tin. All right, so take your tube of bread, plop it in there right in the middle. See, it's in there. This is going to rise and fill up this whole thing. This, on the other hand, is going to free rise. So what that means is we're going to take our tray here, and we're going to take our batard on here and place it here. It should rise more or less evenly. Yeah, so now we are going to set these to rise for 1 hour. I'm going to cover them back up with plastic. The plastic keeps the moisture in. So as much as possible, keep these guys covered. We're going to need a separate piece of plastic, so let's just get that for our other loaf here. Apologies, I'm fighting with the saran wrap today. Don't fight me right now. I really need this to not. Okay. All righty. So we are going to keep these covered. And as usual, we're going to put our towel over them to keep them nice and toasty warm. All right, so now you're going to set another timer for 1 hour, okay? After you do that, you are going to turn your oven on to 400 degrees Fahrenheit. While it's warming up, you are going to paint either with some water or a paintbrush or whatever you have the tops of these two loaves with milk or water, okay? Milk will give you a little bit of a softer crust. Water will give you a little bit of a harder crust. There's one more thing that you can do with these that I'm going to do with mine is you can score them. If you have a lamb to score your bread with, you can use that to make fun designs. I'm just going to use a knife. I'm going to create 3 diagonal strokes on my loaf tin, and I'm going to create 1 or 2 diagonal strikes on my freeform loaf, depending on how it looks. Maybe I'll put in a fun design. We'll have to see. I will be using a knife since I do not have a lamb. But if you have a lamb, obviously make sure to make some fun shapes and send them to us on Facebook.com/LetThemEatBreadShow. And we would love to hear from you. After you do that and your oven is ready, you're going to cook these at 400 degrees for 35 minutes to 50 minutes. They may need as long as an hour, okay? But definitely check them after 35 minutes. Remember, this is very high heat. They will brown. Don't worry about that. It is fine. You will know that they are done if tapping on them, they sound like they are hollow, or you can take internal temperature of them for 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's it. Wait till they are cool to eat them. When you're ready, make sure that you turn out your bread. For your loaf tin, make sure you turn out your bread as soon as it's done onto a rack so that it can get cool instead of continuing to cook, which it may do if it's left in the tin. Okay? That is it for this week. I hope you enjoyed. The recipe is in the description. If you liked it, let me know. This should be the easiest bread recipe you have ever made. Easiest and least costly in terms of ingredients. It makes a great loaf, and this is actually one of my favorite white breads to make and eat. Remember, next episode is on June 12th, episode 12 at noon, 12 p.m. on June 12th. I will see you then, everybody. Take care, and thanks so much. Have a great Memorial Day.